Welcome to Bat Therapy, psychology of Batman, superheroes, and other comic book characters. Be a fly on the wall or a bat in the cave, listening in on a friendship built out of a love for talking Batman, comics, and the everyday struggle to achieve mental health and happiness.
We are your hosts, clinical psychologist Dr. Amelia Brown and educator and comic aficionado Keaton Hopkins. Don't forget to follow us on YouTube and social media and find our Patreon at patreon.com/battherapy.
This podcast is about providing education and understanding and is not a replacement for mental health treatment or support. If you're needing help, go to bat-therapy.com for resources. So, Keaton, I think you have to start this episode with your favorite line.
Human being juice. Oh, Rorschach, what a character. What a character. So today we are going to be talking about Ozymandias, who honestly might be one of my all-time favorite characters in any comic book. Like,
Ooh,
especially villain wise.
Yeah.
Easily top three.
Okay.
Easily top three. I've always just been so enamored with him. I think it's because I was pretty young when I read Watchmen. And so I probably shouldn't have been reading it, if we're being honest. Like I shouldn't. But I was so enamored with him as a villain. He was so complex and just so cool. Like I was always just really infatuated with him. And I feel like after really getting into comics, nobody could top him. And so he's just always stayed at the top of my list as far as best villains.
You know, I know you've talked before about how the villain, especially in like movies and stuff, the villain makes the story.
Yes.
I have to say though, I think I agree. I find his character very intriguing, but I think that what really lifts him up even more is the general story and all of the characters and their different perspectives. I think it even heightens his character even further. It's just it's a great storyline. It's a wonderful storyline. And you just see these different kinds of reactions with superheroes and history and stuff. And I just think that his character on top of that really great storyline just it holds him up as a really, really fantastic character.
Yeah, and it's interesting because so source material wise, getting ready for this one, I read before Watchmen, Ozymandias, which it was, I think, 6 issues. It was a 6-issue run. And then also, of course, there is the Watchmen comic book as well as the Watchmen movie.
Yep.
And then in addition to that, the Watchmen television show that is a direct sequel to the comic, the Watchmen comic. And
which is very interesting because, I mean, the comic and the movie actually have a lot of things in common, but it's interesting that because you just kind of think TV, oh, it's another kind of, video. So you think it would come after the movie, but the slight variations, it clearly follows the comic instead.
Yes, because the biggest difference between the movie and the comic as far as Watchmen goes is the big explosion scene at the end. In the movie. In the comic book, it's like a giant octopus type alien
squid or
thing. Yeah, and that attacks. And so
it's didn't he created it to appear like it's an alien invasion by giant squids.
Right.
Which sure,
he is he's a very interesting character. And then in the comic book he manipulated it so everyone thought it was Dr. Manhattan that did it, right? And so it was different. But one of the interesting things I think about Ozymandias is he's absolutely brilliant.
Mhm.
He knows he's absolutely brilliant
True.
to a fault. Um, and he puts himself on a pedestal, which is funny. A lot of the times,
Mm.
like you'll see villains and it's like the people around them are the ones that are like, "Whoa," right? Like their
Mhm.
followers are just like, "Oh man, I'm gonna follow this guy." It's like the Joker. The Joker has charisma somehow, right? He has so many henchmen,
Yeah.
even though he's the Joker and constantly shoots his henchmen in the face. Like he still has people that are like, you know what? That guy has it all together, right? Like, and but Ozymandias, he is in a crowd of one and he just sees himself as above it all and it starts from when he is a child. So when he's a kid he instantly sticks out in school as a very young child for being so brilliant, um to the point where he almost pretends not to be
Mm,
because
mhm.
he constantly gets accused of cheating.
Oh, wow.
Which
Yeah.
and of course that gives rise to bullying.
Mhm.
He deals with bullying by learning and he goes and as a kid goes and learns kung fu and then goes back and beats the living daylights out of the villains. Not the villains, the bullies. I won't call them villains yet, but bullies
So he
are they're
matrixed them?
right.
He
Yeah.
said, "I'm
They're
getting beat up," so I
I
know
know
kung
kung fu.
fu.
Yeah, exactly.
He
Human
I know
being
kung fu
juice.
himself.
Yeah. Yeah. That's that version. Uh, yeah, and so, yeah, he goes back, he gives, like, one of the bullies a compound fracture, and they're gonna expel him from school, but Ozymandias, Adrian Veidt at the time, he's not
Yeah.
Ozymandias yet. He, his parents are very wealthy, and his dad basically bribes the school and, like,
Mm,
builds them a new wing of the school to let Adrian stay. Um, but eventually his parents pass away and he gives away their fortune
mm,
and he it's funny because reading before Watchmen, he has a lot in common with Batman. It's really
mm.
funny because Adrian Veidt is like if Batman and Lex Luthor
Okay, yeah,
were combined.
'cause I always think about how much he has in common with Lex Luthor, so I think it's fun yeah, it's
Yeah.
interesting that you were thinking of it that way too.
Yeah, and so yeah, he basically he leaves and travels around the world learning martial arts, learning everything
Mm,
from like all the biggest experts. Like it's really kind of like that Bruce Wayne
yeah, yeah.
journey where he's just going around the world learning everything, learning how to fight and just honing his body to the as he says to the peak of human fitness. Um, and at that point, he says one of the things that sticks out is he says that he doesn't see anyone on this earth as being his equal. The only
Mm,
one that would ever even come close would be Alexander the Great.
yeah,
Um, and then he gives himself the name Ozymandias after I think it's King Ramses II. I
yeah,
think
yeah.
was yeah,
It's very telling what he names himself.
right.
Yeah.
Right. And so
And he even
yeah.
in the movie, and I cannot remember if it's in the comic as well, but when you see his lair, there's like a statue of himself in his own lair,
Yeah.
which is an
Yeah.
interesting choice.
Oh, yeah. He's really feeling himself. Like, he's really yeah, I do love a villain that loves himself, and my god, he really does. He really does. And, like, I get it just because, like, he does back it up. Like,
Yeah,
that's one thing that's interesting. He backs it up. It's not one of those things where he gets caught lacking.
yeah,
He honestly succeeds at everything he tries to do.
yep. Well, and that's the thing. So we've talked before about narcissism, narcissistic personality disorder, and so we talked about it with Homelander, and it was like, okay, so a lot of times with narcissism, you think of this grandiosity, and it's like, okay, well, if you're technically actually superior in these objective ways, then where does kind of all that lie versus when is it narcissism versus when is it just not being humble?
Right.
It gets a little complicated with some of these villains, and yeah, I mean, I think he shows it in terms of and by the way, I feel like the title is a spoiler, obviously with Watchmen, you don't know at the start that he is the villain, but
Yeah,
you've
they
had
do a
plenty of
really good
years,
job.
everyone, to to figure this out and
Yeah,
to watch
yeah,
it or
spoiler
read it.
alert, whatever. Like,
Yeah, so
really?
whoops. Yep.
Really? Yeah.
But yeah,
You
I mean,
you saw it
he
in the title.
you saw it in the title, yeah. He though, yeah, from you essentially kinda have to go through the whole storyline again after you find out just how much he's kinda woven into things over time. It was interesting watching Watchmen again because the first time so I watched the movie and then I read the comic.
Mhm.
So my order was different than yours, and so it was interesting going back and watching the movie and picking up on, the little things and paying closer attention to him because he creates this giant plan. And not only does he do this giant plan to manipulate the entire world. So, I mean, essentially, that there's not nuclear war, which I appreciate, by the way. But not only does he do that, but he manages to do it in a way where the guy who can literally see the future doesn't know it's going to happen,
Yes.
which
Like,
blows my mind.
that's one thing. That's why I said he really did give me Lex Luthor vibes, because Lex Luthor does see himself as he has no equal, but what drives him crazy is Superman.
Yeah.
Like, and I say drives him crazy. I know this is a mental health podcast. I drives him, irks him,
There you
bothers
go.
him. We
There you
don't
go.
say
There
the
you go.
C word.
There we go.
Well,
There we
yeah.
go. Yeah.
That's not the worst C word, though. There's a worse C word, but yeah, whatever. But yeah,
Wow.
it absolutely irks him that Superman is out here just stronger than him, faster than him, and there's nothing he can do
Yep.
about it. And it's interesting because he's constantly getting the best of Superman, and Adrian Veidt is or he's the same way, the
Mhm.
way that he manipulates Dr. Manhattan, someone who honestly I put as stronger than Superman.
Agreed.
He
Yeah.
but what makes the Watchmen universe so interesting is Dr. Manhattan is actually the only superhero.
Yes.
He's the only person in that whole universe with powers.
Yeah. Although Andrew, where did I get that from? Adrian
Yes.
Veidt, though, he's so smart that it's almost like a superpower, and his body is so attuned that it's
Yes.
almost like a superpower. So you're right. I mean, it really is this Bruce Wayne, Lex Luthor
Mhm.
combo guy that he really has a lot of prowess. But yeah, I had actually it's so funny because I had misremembered Watchmen and had like autofilled there being more powers throughout with the different characters. But yeah, they do such a great job of essentially creating a lot of superheroes that don't have superpowers, but you have this one, and who boy is he
Yeah.
powerful. And yet he gets got with the best of them.
Yeah. Yeah, and what's so interesting too is no one would have ever seen any of his actions coming had he not killed the comedian.
Mm,
Like, the comedian figured it out, and he killed the comedian, and it was them trying to figure out who killed the comedian that led them eventually to, "Oh, wow,
Well, and
Adrian did this."
yeah, and not only that though, and this is why I find it so interesting. I think that I what's so interesting about this is the comedian. It's not that the comedian finds out.
Yeah.
It's this surprising piece where the comedian, who tends to embrace the grisliest, most grotesque parts of humanity,
Yes.
this is too far for him.
Yeah.
And he crumbles. And
Yeah.
he says, I can't see this much death and loss, even though it's for the quote unquote greater good and whatnot. And and I think that that's why he was the weak spot, because I think that if you had to guess, the comedian would have found a way to be okay with it, but he just the weight of it was too much.
It was too much. And backtracking a bit, one of the one of the things with Ozymandias as well is he sees himself as the only person that can save humanity from themselves. And
Yeah.
he's willing to do anything necessary, which is why he makes this grand plan to is destroy New York City and
Yeah.
kill millions of people, because in his mind, he's potentially saving billions.
Yeah.
And it's one of those things, as soon as you watch it or read it, you realize this is the same thing that America did in World War II when they dropped
Mhm.
the
Yep.
atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So
Yep.
many times, it was so many innocent lives lost.
Mhm.
And we look at it now and they're like, oh, but how many people did we potentially save by doing that? And it's like, you can't look at it that way, which is what drives Rorschach up the wall so much. He's
Yep.
like, no, this isn't okay. You don't know that. You don't know what's going to happen. No matter how smart you think you are, you don't know all people. You don't have it all figured out.
And that, I think, is an interesting thing about villainy. Why is Ozymandias a villain? Or I mean, maybe some people would argue he's not, versus the United States. And once again, we don't necessarily see it as the villain, but I bet some people do. And so that's the thing, right? They talk about who wrote the history books, who had control over the narrative.
Right.
Because yeah, what makes it villainy?
Yeah.
What makes it bad? What makes someone evil? Or if you try and simplify it to that way, what are the deciding factors?
Right. And it's one of those things where you look at the situation and you gauge it, and the only way you can really gauge it is by putting yourself in their shoes and saying, hey, would I do this, or would I not? What choice would I make if I were in that position? Because it's difficult. It is difficult, especially when you see, like, in that era, it's like a super cold war. It's like
Oh
ultra
yeah.
chilly Celsius. It is a cold, cold war.
Which,
And
by the way, I love. So okay, superheroes are a thing. So then Nixon never goes away.
yeah, he never
And
goes away.
speaking of villains, I
Right?
mean, no offense, bro, but you're a bit sketchy. Like, let's be
Yeah.
real. Looking
Yeah,
back at
him and
history,
him and Kissinger, yeah, those guys,
bit of a
yeah,
sketchy
they're
dude. Just because you're a president doesn't mean you're not sketchy.
say
Um,
sketchy, I just say they're bastards. Like, I don't, yeah, it's
he
yeah, I will give
he
them a
so
real
he
label.
stayed president. He wasn't impeached. Not only that, he ends up like never leaving. He gets a third term, which anyone outside of the United States listening, we only have 2 terms at that point. And so it was so interesting. So having superheroes around actually creates an even more intense Cold War than there was with the
Right.
USSR. And then so essentially superheroes can, help with order and reducing crime and da da. But then it had to be counterbalanced by millions of people being murdered
Yeah.
so that so that the Cold War could end and there wasn't a
Right.
nuclear holocaust. Yeah,
Yeah,
wild.
and they use the doomsday clock, like this
Yeah.
clock that's like, "Hey, this is how tense things are." And I'm like, "Who made that? Who's gauging this system right now?" Right?
Yeah.
And it is interesting to me looking at this situation from a historical perspective. What's interesting is there hasn't been another nuclear bomb dropped since those two.
Yeah.
Like, it's very interesting looking at that situation and then looking at this comic book and realizing like, "Oh, okay. I kinda see what they were doing, but the biggest difference is Rorschach told everybody the real deal and what actually happened." And that's one of the things I didn't really dig too much into the Doomsday Clock story that DC did, but
Yeah, I've only read parts of it here and there.
long story short, the world redescends into absolute chaos
Mm.
once that comes out that he did it. And so Adrian disappears into an alternate universe, which is the DC universe with Batman and
Mm.
Superman and everybody, where
Yeah,
Dr. Manhattan also just so happened to disappear too. And
of
that's
course.
a whole nother thing. Um, but yeah, he's very interesting and very conniving. I don't know if conniving's the word, because honestly it was brilliant the way that he manipulates everyone, especially Dr. Manhattan. Like giving like the way that he gave he basically gave cancer to everyone in the
Yeah,
vicinity of Dr. Manhattan to make him think you're the problem.
yeah. So, yeah, once again, who's the villain? What makes someone a villain? So, these are clearly terrible things that he's doing.
Yeah.
He and okay, yes, he's not a humble dude,
No.
okay? Like, let's be real, he ain't humble. He's very prideful, and yet he time and time again shows that he's actually extremely bright, and if ever you're gonna trust that someone can kind of gauge where things are going, he might be one of the people you listen to the closest. He sees this issue coming up and he says, "Okay, how do I fix it?" And supposedly this is how you fix it
Yeah.
is we got to get Dr. Manhattan out of the way so he doesn't stop it, which means we have to distract him by making him think he's giving everybody cancer because of his superpowers. And then we have to kill millions of people, and trick everyone into thinking it's an attack so that the entire world, and we talked about this on the podcast a lot, how do you get people to stop fighting with one another? You find something that they can work toward together. You put them on the same team. And so that's what he did. He put them all on the same team. And you see this so much in all of these different storylines with alien invasions. So he
Mhm.
naturally says, okay, well, in the comics at least, he
Yeah.
does an alien invasion. Um, and it's Actually, I think Watchmen does a really good job of highlighting when is someone a villain and the complexities of that, because Rorschach treats him as the lowest of the low villains.
Right.
Everyone else goes, "Ugh.
Yeah.
What do we do?" And they all were just kind of frozen with it and said, "Well,
Dr.
it's."
Manhattan. Yeah.
Even Dr. Manhattan,
He
the
kills
most
Rorschach, like, to
powerful
keep
being.
him from
Yes!
yeah.
Because they said, "It's already happened, all these lives are lost," and then they see. So I love it. I love how it's like, "Oh, is this like some superpower machine?" He's like, sort of, and he turns on the TV and he just shows how everybody is coming together to counteract this terrible atrocity, and so they're all like, "We can't." They essentially refuse to treat him like a villain and instead kill Rorschach because they say, "You know what? This is getting us where we need to go."
It's like, look, y'all, I did it. I'm a hero. Look how great I am. And it's so bad.
It's so mentally twisty.
It is. It really is. And it kind of like, but honestly, we do see people unite in the face of tragedy. It happened when,
Absolutely.
I mean, 9/11. Oh my
Mhm.
gosh. So much patriotism. So much
Yep.
patriotism after that from all sides.
Yep.
It was not red or blue, it was red and blue. I mean, we
Yep.
were united, and
Mhm.
then a whole lot of war crimes came after that, and that's when people kind of were like, "Oh, well," but yeah, it was a weird time in America, but
Well,
we
and a lot
were
of
yeah.
yeah, I mean, that's a great example, and then, you've got all the like, the world wars happening and how that combined a lot of countries together, and, um, yeah, having a common goal, especially one that isn't especially having a common goal that is incredibly important to everyone. So I think I've talked on here before where they once did this experiment with this camp of boys and they separated them in I think it was like the red team and the blue team
Mhm.
and they competed against each other and they essentially became bitter enemies of one another. And then they said, "Okay, so how do we fix this?" And then they essentially well, they pulled an Ozymandias, but not so intensely. They broke stuff around the camp. And
Yeah,
so the teams had to come together to fix it so that, they had running water and their bathrooms worked and all that stuff. And then they were on the same team. It wasn't us versus them anymore. It was a
right.
we versus the situation. So bringing in an alien invasion in particular is pretty genius, I gotta say.
Yeah.
And I think it does need to be something pretty terrible in order to I think it has to be something pretty terrible in order for it to really pull everyone together instead of kind
Yeah.
of arguing about, which side you might be on and this, that, and the other. But yeah, it's yeah, so when does it go from hero to villain? Or is it both? Or
Well,
yeah.
what's interesting is always thinking about the concept of motive,
Mm.
right? Like I feel like a lot of the times it boils down to a person's motive. I
So kind of
comparing
oh, go for it.
uh comparing Ozymandias to like a James Bond villain. Where a James Bond villain, a lot of times they're just megalomaniacs that's like, I'm gonna start World War III so I can cover it with my news network. Like it's something outlandish,
Yep.
right?
Yeah.
Or the Joker, I'm gonna vaporize Gotham's water supply. Like it's not a it there's nothing in there that says I'm doing the right thing
True.
versus I'm doing what I want. The thing that's interesting about Ozymandias is before all of this happened, before he did this, he was just a hero. He was a
Yeah.
superhero. He did the right thing, right? He gave away his family's fortune to charity and then rebuilt his own fortune. He helped start I think the Minutemen and then
Mm.
the Watchmen. I think there was another one before that, like the Crime Smashers or something. But he was at the forefront of heroics, like in the age of heroes. Like he was a good guy until this, and he even did this because in his mind he was doing it for the right reason, and in reality it worked, but it wasn't okay because the thing and it's I think it's interesting because I feel like it boiled all the way down to, is the loss of human life ever okay?
Yeah.
Right? It's kind of like, oh, like it's the way people fight wars for peace. It's like how like that feels like an oxymoron, right? It's like,
Well, and
yeah.
and so this has me thinking about back in last season when we talked about injustice
Mhm.
and Red Sun for that matter. And just all the Superman ones really
Yeah.
where,
Yeah.
they create fascism and stuff. But, I yeah, it makes me think about, okay, so, we look down on Superman for stopping death, but taking away freedom. But, we also say, okay, well, it's also not good for Ozymandias to, okay, you're jumping in, you're okay with death, but it's creating peace and coming together. And I don't know. I mean, I'm not saying people should go around killing tons of people, and I'm totally with Rorschach in that even the smartest person in the world cannot predict everything. It's just
Yes.
not possible. For example, he did not predict the comedian responding the way he did, or he
Right.
probably would have dealt with that in a better way that wouldn't have unraveled everything. So, he cannot predict everything. And so I think that's one of the issues is and honestly these situations come up all the time. It's just you and me, we're not high up enough on the food chain, shall we say, to know about some of those situations, but unfortunately there are decisions people make where they say, okay, what collateral damage is okay?
Right.
And yeah, it's tricky. And I do agree with you that what is the end goal and what is the intent and the motivation is a very important thing in terms of, is someone a villain? It's kind of too, in our legal system, there's manslaughter versus first degree murder. And, there are all these different layers and levels depending on what's going on. Um, And, I mean, even within the legal system, sometimes it's okay if you kill somebody,
Right.
depending on the situation.
Right.
So, I don't know, it's a complicated thing. He's not cleanly a villain, and I think the show kinda plays up his, let's say, not so humble tendencies,
Yes.
which then you gotta think, okay, how much of this is you just wanted to solve this on your own? And
Yeah.
this is the only way you could do it alone.
He's so quirky in the
Mm,
Watchmen TV show. Oh my
yeah, he
gosh. And
is.
part of it is just I think being stuck on a planet by yourself
With a
for
bunch of clones,
with
yeah.
a bunch of clones for that long. It's so funny. And the first time I watched the show, I was so confused. I was like, what is happening right now? I have no idea what's going on. But yeah, essentially he's basically stuck there because he was trying to create the ultimate utopia, and it's like, oh, look, something you can't do. How does it feel?
Mm,
Like, and it,
yeah.
yeah, it's, yeah,
And, from what you're talking about, and admittedly, I don't know the comic specific to him that's like the precursor, but from what you were describing, he's kind of used to essentially being on a planet all by himself.
hmm,
He he was bullied, he has always been different than everyone else, and that's something actually that really high intelligence or other ways where you see the world very differently that that can be really hard. It can really make it hard to connect to other people.
yeah,
And you know, in a very different expression of it, he's kind of like Dr. Manhattan, where Dr. Manhattan, they actually they have this visual where he wears less and less clothes to essentially signify he's feeling more and more distanced from humanity.
hmm,
And I would argue that in Adrian Veidt, kind of the same way, he also is separate from humanity.
absolutely. And in the Before Watchmen comic, something happens. He does have a girlfriend, and then she overdoses on drugs and dies,
Hmm.
and he becomes a masked vigilante to catch
Oh.
her dealers, to
Yeah.
actually catch her dealers. And it kind of just he kind of evolves as a character uh from there. But yeah, that just goes back to like he started out as a hero and
It
he
always starts that way.
he did what he thought was right. But like you said, in the Watchmen TV show, I think they do a really good job of showing he's not really a hero as much as he loves himself so much. And he is just all about I'm the best and no one else can come anywhere close to me.
And now this is a fictional world, so I guess it's potentially more true, but even the smartest people in the world, they're not the best at everything.
No.
It's
No.
just this is just not how things work. It's kind of like um I have a PhD. I even am further specialized within my field and da da da. And then you'll joke with your colleague about how eh, you don't know science that third graders know.
Yeah.
The more you learn, the more first off, the more you realize you don't know.
Oh my
And
gosh.
then
Yes.
you forget all this other stuff that you don't use anymore. And so some people might be able to do more and more and more and know a lot about a lot of things, but you will never be the best at everything.
It's
And
yeah.
yet he seems to embrace the I am the one that is going to provide the answer to all of this. And it's like, really? Really,
Yeah.
bro? I don't know.
One of the things I always tell my students, I try and tell them on the first day of class, is you are only as smart as where you're standing on the planet.
Mm,
And I tell them that I say, because listen, in this classroom, I probably know more about biology than all of you. I
yeah,
absolutely do. When it comes to science, I am the smartest person in this room. I'm the smartest person in this room when it comes to science. I
yeah.
said, if y'all pulled out your phones, you pulled up TikTok right now,
Oof.
you would know more about it than I do.
Mhm,
I've never had it on my phone. I look at the TikToks friends send me. I don't know the first thing about making one,
mhm.
right? If
Yep, yep.
you were to drop me into the Australian wilderness, unless Crocodile Dundee was there with me, I probably wouldn't make it because
Mhm.
I don't know anything about how to survive in that
Yep.
environment. And I tell them that because I'm like, hey, listen, there will be times when you feel overwhelmed. There'll be times when you will be confused, but it's okay. It's
Yeah.
okay. Versus, like you said,
Mhm.
Ozymandias, he's like, I'm the best at everything. You can put me anywhere and I'm the best, right? Like he's
Yeah.
just,
It's like
yeah,
and here's the thing. I bet if you dropped him in random places, he would be the best in more than your average amount of places.
yes,
Let's say most people, maybe you got one place where you'd be golden. He's got 50, maybe
yeah,
even 5,000 places, but there's no way he's the best at everything. And
right,
he even takes out Dr. Manhattan, who is pretty ingenious himself and also, has like superpowers. He can like create crap on Mars, but you're not going to use that guy to try and sort this thing out.
yeah.
Especially, actually, I would argue that it's potentially more villainous and less heroic because he doesn't utilize Dr. Manhattan. Because Dr. Manhattan, there's this whole thing going on with him where he's becoming less connected to humanity. So if
Hmm.
anyone could objectively set aside the loss of life and look at the different factors and say, yeah, we need to do this, it would be Dr. Manhattan.
Yeah.
So actually, the fact that he takes Dr. Manhattan out, to me, might argue that this was the solution that he could find best in his control.
It's funny because you look at all the characters in Watchmen and you realize that they just go all the way down the spectrum because you
Mhm.
have Rorschach that's like there's good and there's evil, there's nothing in between.
And
And
there's
then you
bean
have
juice.
the right. Yes, human being juice. And then you have someone like the comedian that's just off the deep end and a
Mhm.
direct reflection of whatever society he is in, and not just a reflection of society, a reflection of the worst part of
Yep.
that society, and somehow still being a hero. And I put that in the biggest quotes possible. Very interesting character,
Oh, yeah.
horrible human being.
Jeffrey Dean Morgan, gotta love him.
Oh my god, the best. And then but you have the very human characters like Night Owl and
Mm.
Silk Spectre, who
Who oddly are the least interesting
I know.
characters.
Oh yeah, absolutely,
Isn't that
absolutely.
sad?
I didn't come here to watch normal people be normal. Like, what is this? Uh,
Lame.
right, right. And then yeah, and then you have Adrian and you have Dr.
Mhm.
Manhattan that kind of round out that end of the spectrum where
Yep.
they see humanity more as a question than a living thing. It's almost like they look at it
Mhm.
like a Rubik's cube to
Mm.
solve
Yeah,
instead
yeah, yeah.
of human beings walking around and living on this planet, right? Like, do you think Adrian
Yeah.
Veidt ever went to a furniture store? Like, like, did he ever have to go buy a new mattress? Like, like he is in his own world.
He sees us as like an ant farm.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. Him and
Yeah.
Dr. Manhattan by the end. Dr.
Oh,
Manhattan
yeah.
comes
Mhm.
around. He does come around, but by the time he does come around, he's like, I hate humanity. I'm gonna go live on Mars. And it's
Honestly, Doctor Manhattan, if he had found a way to reconnect to humanity earlier, I think a lot of things would have gone better. Because he once again, he could have been part of the solution.
yeah,
I also think that Adrian Veidt, if he didn't too fully embrace his Ozymandias side, he could have found a way to get Doctor Manhattan actually doing the things that needed to be done. So it is
yeah,
interesting. You have these characters and they get in their own ways.
yeah. Because the thing I always think about it, I'm like, what kept Dr. Manhattan from just disarming every single nuke on the planet? Like he
Well,
could do it.
it's so I think that scene with the comedian is so poignant
Oh yeah, when
where the
they're in
comedian,
Vietnam.
yep, and he shoots
Yes.
and kills the pregnant woman,
Yes.
um, because he just didn't wanna have to take her home with him like he promised.
Yeah.
Uh, super great guy, super great guy.
The best.
Uh, and he essentially pointed out to Doctor Manhattan, "You're as bad as I am, if not worse,
Yeah.
because you could have stopped me very
Yeah,
easily.
you
You
could have
coulda," and
easily
he
stopped it,
listed
but you
all
didn't.
these super heroic things he could have done
Yeah.
to stop him from doing it. And that was one of the first, well, it wasn't one of the first signs, but it was one of the larger initial signs of how, yeah, Dr. Manhattan is becoming too far removed to actually be a part of the solution. But I'm
Mhm.
going to argue it again. If Adrian Veidt had been willing to work with someone else and not just say, "How am I going to solve this myself as the smartest and whatever, the best of them all," I think he could have easily seen, "Oh, Dr. Manhattan, let me get him on board. How
And
do I get him reconnected?"
and the difference too is especially if you look into like the Watchmen TV show, Dr.
Mhm.
Manhattan comes around. He
Yeah.
falls back in love with humanity.
Yep.
He yeah, he does a full heel to face turn, and I don't say heel like he was a villain, but he he even basically is like, I want to live as a human and figure out a way to even forget that I'm Dr. Manhattan and just be a human. Like I just want to live as a human and
Yeah.
fall in love and just live my life. And even after he goes back to being the Dr. Manhattan we know, he's like, it's time for me to get out of here.
Yeah.
Like I'm
I yeah.
yeah.
I keep, this is obviously coming up this season, but so being a villain, a lot of times we think of, okay, so you're you have ill intent. you're usually it's self first, so it's something selfish that benefits you, usually at the detriment of others. You have ill will toward other people. You're doing bad things intentionally, but it's not that simple. So you could also do good things intentionally, but to get to a bad result eventually, right? So like manipulating people, and it
Yeah.
kind of like seems like you're doing good things, but really it's so you can like control stuff or get them get things worse off in the end. But then there's also, I mean, Dr. Manhattan's not a good guy in this.
Right.
I mean, he, like you said, he could have fixed everything, and yet he let millions of people die
Yeah.
for, I mean, essentially no reason.
Yeah.
I mean, people will be people, then we argue like, "Oh, Superman, he stopped all violence." Well, that's not gonna solve, we can always find an issue, but Dr. Manhattan really checks out.
Yeah.
And so he doesn't intend to hurt anybody, but he sure doesn't intend to help anybody either.
Yeah. And it's interesting because you look at Adrian's plan and everything that comes with it. It's the society at the time before Adrian's plan plays out is a society that's completely being manipulated by fear.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah, yeah.
Adrian's plan goes through and the world is still being manipulated
Yep.
by fear. It's just a different fear.
Sure.
Then Dr. Manhattan gets manipulated by Adrian again because he's like, hey, if you tell it, what do you think's going to happen? It's
Mhm.
still manipulation by fear. It's still
True.
manipulation
Yeah.
by fear. And at that point, too, Dr. Manhattan is not only looking at it as like, it might not even necessarily be a fear manipulation, but what Dr. Manhattan is doing is looking at humanity the same way Ozymandias is by
Yep.
saying, hey, they're an ant farm.
Yep.
What's going to help the most ants?
Yep.
What's going to solve this humanity Rubik's Cube?
Well, and I mean, let's be real. So Adrian says, "Yo, Dr. Manhattan, you haven't been doing anything for people so far. So don't do anything now."
Yeah.
I mean, he's not asking much of Dr. Manhattan really, because Dr. Manhattan has been kind of sitting on his laurels for a while. I
Yeah.
mean, he's been claiming that he's like working on constructing this stuff to kind of resolve everything, but I don't know. I don't know. I'm not convinced that he would just kind of fall for that. It's almost like I keep getting this picture in my mind. Like let's say that you've got like a highway, and he's sitting by the edge of the highway, and he keeps seeing like a bunch of animals crossing the highway and getting hit by cars. And for the first few, you're like, oh man, like he doesn't know what's happening, and um, he doesn't know what to do, and da da da. By the 100th or 1,000th animal getting hit by a car, is he still
Yikes.
not a bad person in this scenario?
Right.
Like, at that point, it's like, okay, you're not intentionally having them harmed, but you're also, I mean, at that point, are you intentionally being passive
Yeah.
and intentionally allowing it to happen? I don't know. Like, at a certain point, I think his role shifted to a gray area, and Adrian Veidt just leaned into that quite a
And
bit. So, yeah.
one of the things that's interesting about Dr. Manhattan too is how when they give his story and he shows up, he's like, I'm above it all. I am the ultimate. I am super powered.
Mhm.
But he's constantly being manipulated. I mean, Nixon talks him into going and fighting in Vietnam. Like, are you kidding me?
Yeah. Okay,
Like,
fair. Yeah.
like what? Like, how? How? Like, you see the big picture, and yet Richard Nixon talked you into intervening
Yeah.
in Vietnam. And
Yeah.
it's just it's he's a very interesting character because it's like, hey, look, he has all the powers you could ever want or need in a
Mhm.
superhero, but he might actually be more human.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing too is that just because someone has a lot of power doesn't mean they're perfect.
Yeah.
Doesn't mean they're not human. And actually, okay, so this dude was like a super scientist before. I mean, he was
Right.
doing all these experiments, and that's how he turned into Dr. Manhattan. So, much like Adrian, he potentially wasn't connected to a lot of people in the first place. He might have felt very separate in terms of his intellect and how he connected with people. Not to stereotype or anything, but if you're like that kind of heightened scientist, there is that potential. And then you kind of add in what you were just talking about. So he has all these superpowers. Um maybe he felt a bit disconnected to the rest of humanity to start with, and then you add all these powers and it just really took it to the extreme.
Yeah.
Cuz yeah, you'd hope he'd have a better sense of what Nixon was doing or what anyone was doing, but yeah, it seems like a lofty disconnect, but it could also be that he just never really fully understood other people. And then you add in the powers and it just gets worse because
Yeah.
everyone's trying to be around him at that point and he doesn't know what to do with them still.
Yeah. And he just gets farther and farther away.
Mhm.
And
And then you hang out with Nixon for a while and ugh.
because it's I'm not gonna his decision to leave Earth and go live on Mars,
Mm.
very human decision.
Mm.
Very human decision. I'm not gonna lie. There have been so many times when I've wished I just want to go and just be somewhere completely by myself. I
Yeah.
am really not vibing with humanity right now. Like I
Mm.
felt that way. Like whether it's during the pandemic or during a horrible election season, like
Mm.
whenever or like another
School just started.
mass
I had to drive
shooting,
through yeah,
you
I had to
know,
drive through town today and I saw all the idiots on the road.
it's you get in
Even
this
small
position
things.
where you're
Yep.
just like, I wish
Mhm.
I could just disappear from all of this and just be somewhere where none of this is,
Mm.
right? And so the thing is like his reaction to things are more human than I think he realizes. Like, yeah, you have the
Probably.
powers, but
And he definitely strikes me as someone who has a lot of emotional numbing.
mhm,
So some people, when a lot of stuff has happened, they'll get very emotionally reactive.
yeah,
And so these are the people who if they found out like, oh, you're getting treatment or you're on meds or da, da, people be like, okay, yeah, I could kind of see that because like it's just it a lot of times might come out in one way or another.
mhm,
But then sometimes what can actually happen is a person's feeling things and they tamp it down, and some people are numbed. And so here's the problem that also happens with Dr. Manhattan is that you can't numb out just one emotion. They're all tied together and it's all kind of one kind of network of things that will happen and react in you. And so if you numb one, you numb everything.
yeah,
And so yeah, I think he's seeing all of these things and he's numbing. And then
yeah,
when he numbs all the bad stuff like say Vietnam, he also numbs his personal connections. So then he leaves the woman he was with and he ends up with another woman who then he ends up numbing out on her too.
mhm,
Then he goes to Mars. There's yeah, there's a lot of this emotional suppression happening for him. And by the end, says, "Okay,
yeah,
a million people died, and I'll in the movie at least, I'll take the blame."
yeah, and
Mm,
it goes all the way back to bring it back to Adrian. Ozymandias is like, yeah, I did this horrible thing, and it leaves us, the readers and watchers, going, who's worse, the person that did it, or the person that knows they did it, and they're just like, yeah, I'll keep your secret. You know, like it's oof, it's bad because he kills Rorschach. Like, he kills
So
Rorschach
that
to
that
keep.
takes it to the next level, I'll say.
Yeah.
But yeah, I honestly I don't.
Yeah.
Because here's my thing. Like, I'm all about openness and honesty, and you have to do that to get to the core of things and to have healing and growth. But then you have this really terrible thing that happened, and it's based on a lie, or it's there's a lie surrounding it, and that lie will help things move to a better future versus the truth. Well, hmm. So I was gonna say that the truth would kind of ruin it all, which maybe, but why couldn't Ozymandias be the villain here instead of Dr. Manhattan?
Yeah.
The aliens make more sense to me because the aliens, once again, it's something obviously separate. That's from another planet, us versus them. But with what the movie did, I would argue is not a strong case for why it needs to be Dr. Manhattan instead of Ozymandias.
So
He could still be the villain
I
and it
think
would do the same.
I think the reasoning for I think the reason they did that is because Dr. Manhattan is a villain they can't defeat. If they all found out Ozymandias did it, I mean, yeah, he can fight back, but a bullet will eventually work on him. He's a human. As a matter of
I
fact,
mean, I suppose, but he caught one in the movie.
yeah, he caught one. He caught one, right? Put a minigun in front of him. Ozymandias is
He's not gonna let
Ozymandias.
you put, oh, jeez. He's not gonna let you do that.
But like,
Come
yeah, I'm just
on.
like I
You said earlier he is Batman plus Lex Luthor. That man's not gonna
yes,
let any guns near him.
I get it. I get it. But I really do think that it would not have united the people
Mm,
if one man had done it. Because honestly, this is what would have happened. Russia would have saw that he did that and they would have been
they would've
like,
blamed the US
yeah,
probably. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, and
it wouldn't have solved anything.
I guess Dr. Manhattan is superhuman and almost alien-like.
Yeah.
Okay, I'll give you that argument. I just don't think it's as strong as alien squids.
Yeah.
Thanks for nerding out with us. I'm clinical psychologist Dr. Amelia Brown.
And I'm educator and comic aficionado Keaton Hopkins. Check out my TV and movie reviews on YouTube at Team JVS. Check out our website at bat-therapy.com, our Bat Therapy YouTube channel, and follow us on social media. And don't forget our Patreon page at patreon.com/battherapy. See you next week. Same bat time, same bat channel.